Dr. Smith. Maybe a couple of seconds and I will.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and you are watching A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist and former Pentagon analyst Paul Buchanan. And this week we are going to discuss the US Electoral College has confirmed Joe Biden as the president-elect. So what does this mean for the South Pacific? And China and the USA are clearly global powers operating in the South Pacific, but how does France fit into this mix? But first, before we get into these issues, here's an invitation to those of you who are joining us live. If you are joining us via Facebook, Twitter or YouTube, feel free to make comments, and if you do, we'll be able to include your interaction in this program. So let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online to get into these major geopolitical issues. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon, Selwyn, and happy Hanukkah and happy Kwanzaa for our Jewish and African friends around the world. The festive season is not just for white folk, although certain media outlets would have you believe that is the case.
That is the case. No, it's a wonderful time of year, no matter how you approach it. You know, happy holidays, happy Christmas, happy whatever. You know, it's a kind of thing, particularly in a year like 2020, isn't it good to actually have a line in the sand where we can basically define the past as opposed to the current contemporary, and that's something to look forward to the new year. That's something.
Yeah, I mean, you and I are lucky. You know, we live in a place that's well governed, that uses science to deal with pandemics. Some of our viewers are not quite as lucky on that score, but yeah, let's just hope that we're turning a page both politically and scientifically or medically, and next year will be a better one.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go for that. And that's all you can do, isn't it? To do your best, and there's some good leaders starting to actually shape up around the world that perhaps will make a difference as well. So that's something. So you know, and speaking of which, we've got a change in the White House pending. Officially, the Electoral College in the United States has voted that Joe Biden is the president-elect, and that's obviously sending strong signals around the world, with even Vladimir Putin, the Russian Federation, conceding that Donald Trump has, in his view, you know, lost the election, and wishing Biden well and reaching out across those continents. So many others have obviously already done so, Paul, earlier on, but this is getting closer to Inauguration Day. I suppose from my point of view too, you know, just at the front end of it, it's an uneasy time because of the erratic nature of Donald Trump. And while he is still the president of the United States in this lame duck period, there's always that concern of what would he do. But putting that aside, before we get into the debate, what do you make of the Electoral College vote, the reactions inside the United States? Is there a sense of ease? How are you reading it, Paul?
Oh, well, like so many other people, I'm reading it with a sign of relief, because I actually believed for a while there that the electors might violate the popular vote in their states. With all the appeals that were being made by Trump and his surrogates, I thought there might be some defection in the ranks, make it closer, and then we'd be involved in an imbroglio that would go well past Inauguration Day. Instead, a large part of the Republican Party stood up for constitutionality and institutional continuity, and all credit to them for understanding the stakes. You know, again, it's not the person, it's the institutions. And Trump conflated the two. He distorted the two, and I would think he corrupted the two. But in the end, the Electoral College delivered on what was expected of it. And at that point, the Republican leadership, which up until then had been singularly marked by its cowardice in the face of Trump's remonstrations, basically in its majority turned around and upheld the rulings of the Electoral College. Now,
we also saw earlier in the week that the Supreme Court refused Trump's police before it as well. So perhaps that was a tipping point for the Republicans, the GOP as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're focused today on other things. I'll just say two things to finish off with the Electoral College. The first one is we still have a settling of accounts with the 126 Republican congressmen who supported Trump and wanted to challenge, in fact, wanted to overturn the results of the election before the Electoral Colleges ruled. And I won't say that it was treasonous because they filed Friends of the Court briefs, but these amicus briefs were ones that were sent to the Supreme Court. You know, the Supreme Court decided not, they thought that the lawsuit was so frivolous that they wouldn't even hear it. But 126 Republican congressmen out of 198.
Yeah, that's a big group, isn't it?
That's a big group. That means that you've got that disloyal opposition in the House.
Yeah.
And
is this what Mitt Romney from Utah was speaking to in a sense, about, the GOP's factions and trying to actually establish some sort of vision for the GOP? Is that what he was doing earlier this week, do you think?
Oh, yes. I mean, he's always been a never Trumper. And I'll give him credit for that. He recognized Trump for what he was very early on. And, what we're basically seeing here is the fracturing of the Republican Party. Because Trump will remain a political force, especially if he's able to build a media empire and have a war chest to back primary candidates over the next several years. But you're going to get to see now divisions between the sort of mainstream traditional Republicans that we've talked about in the past and this sort of nationalist populist faction. And I live with a political scientist, professor of politics, and we've been commenting in the House that it appears that these people either don't care about democracy, they just care about power, or they don't understand democracy as a mutual second best sort of enterprise. That is, no one can get everything they want all of the time, but everyone can get some of what they want some of the time, and they're guaranteed to be able to compete down the road at regular intervals. So you accept the losses so that you can come back down the road and compete for the things that are a priority to you. Well, the Republican Party clearly has issues with that fundamental democratic fact, and this may come out in the wash now. In the meantime, Biden is going to be conciliatory. I mean, he's definitely turned his back on his progressive wing, much to the disgruntlement of the left side of the Democratic Party. But he's doing so because he doesn't give the Republicans in Congress much room to maneuver if he's constantly reaching across the aisle to get their cooperation on some fundamentally pressing policy issues that will not go away anytime soon. So a good moment for the United States now that we've turned the corner on the elections. Like I say, Trump will continue to bark from the sidelines, but we're on to bigger and better things in the U.S., one would hope. And the question then for us in the South Pacific is, how is this going to impact us both over the short term and then looking down the road another 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, and in particular, we're all very aware of the two major powers that are operating in the South Pacific, China and the United States. And we've discussed in previous episodes, haven't we, Paul, about the oscillation, if you like, where the United States under Donald Trump, politically at least, was regressing back into the United States, back into an isolationist kind of pattern, which seemed to see the response from China, trade wars notwithstanding, actually moving in more solidly, asserting its might amongst those other regional powers like Australia and the South Pacific, etc., and Asia Pacific, Indo Pacific, whichever way you want to define it. So what kind of a change do you think that the Joe Biden administration will make with respect to those types of configurations, Paul?
Okay, well, the starting point is this. Trump's approach to international affairs, and certainly to the Western Pacific Rim, was a go-it-alone approach, basically. He thought that he could bully China. He could bully China with his sanctions. He could saber rattle in the Western Pacific without alliance partners that the United States could go it alone. So, although he was neo-isolationist in the main, where he did try to use military diplomacy or diplomacy in general, it was very confrontational, it was very bilateral, it didn't involve others, and it failed.
Almost geopolitically immature in a sense.
Very well phrased. That's exactly what it was. And it failed. Bottom line is the Trump foreign policy was an abject failure like so many other of his initiatives. So the good news is that the U.S. foreign policy can be resurrected Phoenix-like from the ashes of the Trump administration. And what that means, specifically under Biden, is a return to that liberal internationalism that we've talked in the past. But for us specifically, what it means is a reaffirmation of the alliance structures that Trump neglected, particularly with NATO allies, with European powers, and down here with Australia, New Zealand, as well as our northern neighbors like Japan, Korea, Singapore. I would argue that we'll see the Indonesians brought into the fold by the United States. And the reason for that is one thing: China. All of this is a defensive reaction to Chinese power moves in the Western Pacific, which are now having repercussions deep into the South Pacific in the Pacific Island states. So he will reaffirm all of this alliance structure in a measure that we haven't seen since the Obama administration. But let's be honest, the Obama administration, for all the talk that had occurred about a pivot to the Pacific and whatnot, really didn't commit the resources to signify that that was a real pivot. That is now about to happen. I mean, already, true, 60% of U.S. naval assets are in the Pacific already.
Yeah, we talked about that in previous episodes, didn't we? Yeah.
But we're going to see Air Force assets. We're even going to see land-based assets. So, for example, the expansion of the Marine base in Darwin. We're about to see, a growing American footprint, which is not always good.
I was just going to say, on that kind of point, in normal times, an increase of military hardware from any power in a particular region that has seen no conflict for many years on a large scale would be an issue of concern. Do you see that this is basically just a re-establishing of the United States' presence in an obvious way that is actually more politically motivated as opposed to defense retaliatory type of positioning?
Well, it's a bit of both. I mean, there's definitely military diplomacy, but the team that Biden's bringing into play are experienced operators. So there are going to be aid packages for the more underdeveloped countries in the southwestern Pacific Rim. I mean, one thing that's interesting, which we haven't talked about on this show, is that the U.S. is about to reestablish the First Fleet. The First Fleet has not been in commission since 1970.
Wow.
And it's going to be forward ported somewhere in the Western Pacific. The arguments now are perhaps in Perth, perhaps in Darwin as a complement to the Marine presence, perhaps someplace further east. But an entire fleet is going to be positioned permanently in the Western Pacific. The only other one is the the third fleet, the fifth fleet, excuse me, the third fleet, sorry, in Okinawa. And so that's the hard edge of that move. But there will be a diplomatic move as well. And here's where I think the liberal internationalism may be helpful. Biden realizes, even though he continues to couch his foreign policy language in that, the U.S. is the superpower, the U.S. is, the shining house on the hill, but he's couching it increasingly as being one amongst equals, the centerpiece of various alliance structures that themselves are interconnected. So,
well, that's interesting. That's a reasonably new way of looking at it, isn't it?
It is. It's not only reaffirming the alliances, but it's reaffirming the value of individual partners in those alliances because some of those partners have global reach. Let me give you an example. France. Now, we tend to think, or at least people in the Anglophone world, tend to think of France as a bit of a nuisance in Europe, that has to be continually rescued from its own mistake, that sort of palaver. The French actually are a formidable force worldwide. They have an extensive presence in the South Pacific dating back to the colonial eras, and they're right now mired in a bunch of post-colonial issues, but they also have the second biggest exclusive economic zone in the world, and that's in the South Pacific. It covers, millions of kilometers of maritime territory. So they have extensive responsibilities when it comes to maintaining the sea lanes of communication open in their spheres of influence, anti-poaching activities, anti-piracy activities. The French are the leading edge of the spear in their patch of the Pacific, and so they are an integral part of any alliance structure that's going to be erected, regardless of the Chinese, but certainly because of the Chinese. And recognition of that is the fact that France was admitted about 5 or 6 years ago to full membership in the Pacific Island Forum. When the Pacific Island Forum was formed, they weren't even considered because they were a colonial master.
And
they
had
were,
observer status at best up until the 5 years ago.
At best. But they were a pariah. But what's happened is the concerns about the Chinese, and then the fact that the former colonies, what are called special territories or special autonomous zones, are independence referenda have been rejected in these territories. The majority, and there's many demographic reasons for that, because there's a lot of French expats, but the fact is they've been rejecting full independence. And so, for example, New Caledonia, which is a place that I have visited recently, their education system is French. Their welfare system is French. Their gendarmes are French.
Yeah.
There are no import duties on French goods and services. So they are French.
The coronavirus problem that they've got there is French as well.
It's French.
Yeah.
Although it's worse in French Polynesia than French Melanesia. And I guess that's something that we know very well, but to particularly our American audiences. So France is in Polynesia, which is sort of center and eastern Pacific. Melanesia is on the far western rim, includes Papua New Guinea. They're very different peoples, let's put it that way. The French have colonized both sides. The French Pacific Navy is based in Tahiti. The French Pacific Army is based in New Caledonia. The naval fleet is small, 2 frigates, 4 patrol boats, and logistical vessels, as well as an air complement. In New Caledonia, at any one time, there are between 6,000 and 8,000 French troops and an Air Force squadron. So they exercise regularly with the Australians in jungle warfare. One year in New Caledonia, the next year in Australia. My point being is the French footprint in the South Pacific is very large, very, very large. And they are tied in to the security alliances that are spearheaded by the United States and Australia.
So look, let's
be reaffirmed.
Yeah, it's reaffirming already. What we saw 6 days ago just got up on screen here. And just bear in mind, viewers, that this is coming out of the United States Department of Defense, defense apparatus here, and produced by them. But the important thing here is to see what the United States is doing now. Trump's out of the road. It's obviously sensed the change. It's obviously debated the change and organised the change and put it in sync. We've also seen in recent weeks the Australians signing a defence pact with Japan, and that comes into play here as well. But let's just play this clip.
Because they were underestimated, the United States Navy was angry with China. In fact, the US Navy immediately invited 2 countries, namely Japan and France, to attack China in the Pacific. The US Navy invites the 2 countries to conduct large-scale military exercises in front of the Chinese state in May 2021. This large-scale military exercise aims to counter Chinese aggression claiming Japanese-controlled islands in the East China Sea. The French Chief of Staff Admiral Pierre Vandier explained that this war game was a form of cooperation between Paris and Tokyo. This is a distress signal aimed at Beijing. It is a message about a close multilateral partnership and regional freedom in the Pacific.
So I guess our viewers get the point there, Paul. It's well illustrated in what you were saying there. This clip is, bringing that into space really. So with all of this, what do you see is going to be the impact on China? Before we do, I really should just note a couple of things that have happened this week. The Australians have taken China to the World Trade Organization, and that is about the issues that we've discussed in previous episodes, and importantly last week as well, where China has been applying huge tariffs on the wine industry. It's been banning barley exports from Australia to China on the basis of saying that it's been subsidised by the Australian government, so therefore there is dumping going on in breach of the trade agreements that it has with Australia. Australians are saying enough's enough, we're taking that to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So China is under pressure there. The Financial Times 2 days ago came out with a major analysis piece where it was analysing the centralisation of Chinese foreign financial interests with respect to the Belt and Road Initiative. They're saying it's basically where it's been an expansion for some time. The Financial Times was saying that China has overstepped the mark relating to its financial investments in the Belt and Road Initiative, that it is on the breach of breaching, if you like, its loan agreements with various companies, including Venezuela, including those developing countries right through Central Asia, etc., etc. So there's pressures on there. They're saying that it is pulling internally to China. At the same time, we've seen a change pending in the White House. We've seen a more obvious overt presence of the United States. We've seen the signing of defence pacts between Australia and Japan. We've seen a firming up of the region at ASEAN that we discussed some weeks ago now, where they're more agreeable to forming pacts within themselves. We've seen problems with India and China on border skirmishes, and also India taking part in military exercises in the region. This is a lot of stuff happening in the last month, Paul, and China is the one that is standing out. The question put back to you again is, what do you think China's actions are going to be with considering these kind of moves?
Well, it's interesting because all of this reaffirms something that you and I have talked about from time to time, which is that old axiom of international relations that miscalculations are a major source of conflict and strife in world affairs since time immemorial. And what I think we're starting to see here, and I say some of this based on leaks from the Chinese Communist Party, there are now leaks coming out of the party that all is not well with President Xi. There is discontent because he mishandled the Wuhan virus, the coronavirus in the first instance. His instinct was to suppress rather than reveal so that he could get international assistance. He went for the sort of xenophobes approach to things, and then he punished anyone who tried to get the word out that this was much worse than a localized infectious disease.
So this is through December through January last year, that time window. Yeah.
When they could have gotten a better grip on it in Wuhan, he was more into saving face. And you can't run any sort of modern regime, much less a modern authoritarian regime, if issues of face will stymie effective implementation of public policy, much less national health security measures. So there's some discontent about the way that was approached. And then there's discontent with the fact that he's being, in the eyes of the more moderate or liberal factions within the Communist Party, way too aggressive in foreign policy, biting off way too much than he can chew, both financially as well as militarily. And COVID plays into that because with the downturn in economic production, with the loss of revenues coming from abroad, the Belt and Road Initiative, which was basically riding on a wave of giddy optimism about the results down the road, came screeching to a halt. And so, as you just pointed out, they're overextended in a major way, and that doesn't even count the pushback in various countries around the world to the very large Chinese presence and the bullying approach the Chinese have to their developmental partners. It's as if the Chinese learn nothing from the imperialist experiences of the past and are repeating the same mistakes and then adding a few of their own. Well, that engenders resentment worldwide. But I think the precipitating event, and you mentioned Kashmir, you mentioned the Chinese, the Indo-Chinese conflicts in the Himalayas. I think the precipitant event for this reforging of international coalitions, both diplomatic and military, was Hong Kong.
Yeah.
I think Hong Kong was an insult to the international community because there was an agreement on a staged incremental takeover by the PRC of Hong Kong over 50 years. It was agreed on by the former colonial master. It was accepted by the international community, and the Chinese went ahead and breached the agreement, halfway through the timetable for devolution, and they've been pretty harsh about it. I think that was a wake-up call for the international community that China is no longer willing to play by the rules. And if it's not willing to play by the rules on issues of sovereignty and autonomy for this micro state, then what does it say about its approach to the WTO? We saw that it didn't cooperate with the World Health Organization initially when it came to And so I think that the international community has come to the realization that more than likely for internal reasons, President Xi is not an honest actor. And he's centralized his power, so you can't get around him to other members of the Communist Party leadership because of what he's done internally to that party.
I think I think too. Sorry, Paul. Just on the issues relating to multilateralism, if China's diplomats and the PRC itself is still reading that multilateralism is dead, then they need to have another look, because multilateralism is going to once again be kicked into life in 2021 and onwards, through necessity by the West, obviously. So those bodies where under Trump were treated with disdain and a common kind of wipe off the table type of approach from the Trump administration, it's going to be a different kettle of fish with the Biden administration. With China thinks it can continue to ignore those bodies of which it had striven over decades to become a member of, and the WTO is obviously significant. If it's going to treat it with contempt in the same way that Trump has, well, it's got a real problem on its hands. If China's ambitions are going to be met by anything, it is about trade relationships and progress through those kind of configurations, as opposed to military might and diplomacy with an iron fist around the region. So I think that is how I'm seeing it, Paul, and hopefully that dovetails into where you see the region as well from the point of view of the challenges of the Chinese. If the diplomatic corps within the PRC starts reading the tea leaves a little bit more accurately, then perhaps there'll be behavioural changes and there'll be some sort of rebalancing of the problems of imbalance that developed over the last 4 years of the Trump administration.
Well, certainly, the Biden administration is going to have to offer a carrot as well as a stick when it comes to rekindling the relationship, the bilateral relationship with China. But there's a bigger issue that you've alluded to, and very well done in doing so. China is already a presence in all international organizations and multilateral forums. So there's no reason for it to bully. There's no reason for it to be so aggressive, because it's already been accepted as one of the great powers in the world system. It's in.
At the top table.
It's right. It is part of the status quo. In fact, it's an integral part of the global status quo. So all of this pushing and shoving is unnecessary. And you may remember me saying to you a while back that the difference between a great power and a superpower is that a superpower intervenes in the international system to preserve the status quo because it is at the head of that status quo. Great powers intervene in the international system to promote their own national interests. China is behaving like an insecure great power. If it doesn't get what it wants in international forums, it starts pushing and shoving.
That's interesting because there's one element that we witnessed in Fiji, for example, only a matter of less than 2 months ago, where the diplomats from the PRC, the People's Republic of China, actually had a fist fight with the delegates from Taiwan in Suva.
Yeah.
This it kind of shows how much pressure the two sides are under. Taiwan certainly knows how to get under the skin of the Chinese diplomats whenever it wishes to, but that kind of reaction is, that's odd, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, let's look at it this way, because you mentioned Chinese diplomacy.
Yeah.
And you and I have both met Chinese diplomats. They're very urbane, very well educated. But here's the interesting thing. Most Marxist-Leninist-based parties, Maoism is basically an offshoot, organizationally speaking, of basic Leninist principles of party organization. And I say that because they always had political commissars in the military, in the diplomatic corps, in order to keep ideological purity inside these major channels of communication with the outside world, as well as promote, ideological uniformity within those organizations themselves. Well, China is not a socialist state. China is a state capitalist country run by a one-party authoritarian regime. But it still has political commissars in its military, and for the purposes of our discussion today, in its diplomatic corps. Now, the trouble with that is your diplomatic corps is your face to the world. It's the sponge where you receive feedback from all the interlocutors that you have to deal with. And when you're a great power, you're dealing with economic entities, non-state actors, the full spectrum of international actors. And you can't be ideological or doctrinaire when you're interacting with them, because that'll make you blind or deaf to some of the things that they're saying or what you're seeing. And yet the controversy recently, following on the heels of that little dust-up in Suva, was that it's now been revealed that there are Communist Party members layered throughout the Chinese diplomatic corps in the South Pacific and beyond. Lots of Chinese Communist Party. And their loyalty is to the party, not to the nation. There's a big distinction between love of motherland and love of party. And the question then is, many Western interlocutors are simply alarmed by the presence of Communist Party members. I'm not alarmed. What I say is that is a sign of weakness. They still don't have the confidence to allow independent-minded diplomats to interact and report back to them the truth as they see it. What they want is someone who literally adheres to the party line. And, that makes you deaf to a lot of things that are being said. And I think now we've got a vicious loop where the feedback loop from the diplomatic outposts regurgitates what the party leaders want to say, and then the party leaders reaffirm that's the way we should proceed. When in fact, if you just sat back as a Chinese diplomat, if you could honestly report, and they clearly cannot, you would say, bosses, we got a problem. We have people who otherwise would not get along together now forming defensive alliances against us. They don't like how we're proceeding. They don't like the way we do business. We need to think about this because they're forming economic, diplomatic, and military alliances, if not to ring fence us, to put, a common front to their defensive efforts in a measure that we haven't seen in the past. So we need to wake up that we're annoying people in various fronts, and then agitating behind all of that is our great power rivalry with the United States. So even though the Chinese have opened up some diplomatic and military channels with the Russians, the fact is that they're increasingly isolated diplomatically, and COVID helped accelerate that whole process by removing a lot of the sources of their economic strength. And China, without its economic power, essentially a really big stand. It's Kazakhstan, on a big scale, but it doesn't have the economic power to make its will be felt on the international stage. So I disagree with a lot of the Western strategists in that they see China as very powerful and only going to grow in that power in the next decades. I see trouble inside China, particularly within the Communist Chinese Party, which to me explains some of this aggressive behavior, and most importantly, the myopia displayed in exercising that behavior or exercising that power in the way that China has done. So, Biden can do a lot if he comes in and offers them carrots to return to a position of responsibility within the international community. But if he can't, that stick is going to be multilateral as well.
So I suppose in summing up, Paul, the United States is on track towards some of the solutions that are in its interests on many, many different type of levels. And now the onus is on China to basically respond in the same.
Yeah, I don't mean to say that the United States is going to return to its old positions of glory. It's not. It will not. It will never be a superpower again. As much as my American friends may hate to hear that, it will be a great power, but it will share the stage. One thing that Biden said that was very disheartening for me was he said we have to reclaim our place at the head of the table. Yeah. Meaning the international community. And I thought to myself, no, you reclaim your place at the table. Forget the head.
Yeah.
It's a round table. It's a round table with other powers.
I'd put it like a place of significance.
Yeah, you could be maybe first amongst equals, but the point is those days of unilateralism, unipolarity, they're over.
Yeah.
And Biden, I hope he recognizes that his version of liberal internationalism has to be nuanced, has to recognize that fact without making a big public, issue of it for domestic political reasons.
The United States, on the issues of legitimacy, it may wish to have a look at what Bill Clinton signed up to all of those years ago when he was president, the International Criminal Court. On issues of justice and global justice, perhaps the United States should rethink its turning away from those principles when the George W. Bush pulled the United States' membership out of the ICC. And then perhaps Security Council reform that is in favour of the world as opposed to just the great powers that sit around the table. That would be something would be very interesting to see too, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the last one might be in the too hard basket. Just because there are other interests at play. But you're absolutely right. One of the first order of business will be the U.S. recommitting to the Paris Accords, all these international treaties and obligations that Trump unilaterally abandoned. The Iran nuclear deal will be a good signal.
Yeah.
Because, it's one of those sayings, keep your friends close and keep your enemies even closer. The U.S. needs to be able to show that when it comes to adversaries, there's some degree of subtlety. There's some degree of understanding of the other side. I'm not saying that we need to understand, for example, every logic that compels the North Koreans to do what they do. But having this simply, we don't recognize you, we don't talk to you type of approach with some adversaries, and then toadying up to others because of some mistaken belief that a personal relationship can somehow become a nation-to-nation friendship, that's over. There needs to be, and he will he will move quickly.
The
on
last,
things like,
meaning Biden.
you know, Biden will move quickly on some of these major issues. You brought up a great point. If he shows that the United States is willing to put itself and its people before the International Criminal Court, that we understand that when it comes to international human rights and that sort of thing, we are no better than anyone else. And I say we, the collective we of the United States. That will be a great signal that the United States is willing to return to the community of nation exactly the way we want the Chinese to.
Yes. Gives
and,
legitimacy to the voice. That's
exactly.
the principle of what I'm talking about there.
Good point.
The last thing I think that anyone would want to, if China becomes even more isolated, that it starts using its only left allies, meaning North Korea, as some sort of pawn in a geopolitical game. That would be chaos, and that would be very disruptive, obviously, to the world order. But Paul, what a wonderful kind of way to, show the 2020 from a geopolitical point of view from the South Pacific here. This is our last episode for 2020. We are going to be looking forward to coming back in 2021 in January at some point, probably the second week maybe, and where we'll be discussing these kind of trends and the detail on a weekly basis going forward. And Paul, I'm very proud and pleased to have you on board with this A View from Afar, and it was your initiative in the first place, and I'm blimmin' pleased that we've pulled it together. So happy Christmas, happy holidays, happy everything else for the end of 2020, happy New Year. Look forward to your company again, Paul, in the early New Year, and also to you viewers who are on live and also on demand and via the podcasts on Apple Podcasts, which is the old iTunes. We've got iHeartRadio now, and we've got Spotify and others as well, other smaller ones too. So that's an exciting event for this particular program for 2021. Until then, goodbye.